All right, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to MTM's Adult Lecture Series for October. We are so thrilled to have Karen Sieber back this month. Last month she gave an incredible lecture on hobo culture, and this month she is here to talk about a very interesting project for MTM, our Justus Ramsey House, that is going to be relocated onto our grounds in the near future. She's going to explain the history and the project and where we're heading, and I am very excited to hear more about this from Karen. So please give her a round of applause.
All right, thanks for having me back. Just so I have a good grounding here, who is familiar with the Justus Ramsey House? Okay, that's good. About half and half. It gives me an idea of how much information you have or how much would be good to share. So let me see here. So the Justus Ramsey House, as Marie said, is going to be relocated here to open next year. You may have seen the dirt and trees uprooted and some kind of action going on there on the side of the property. That will be where the Justus Ramsey House will sit. And so how did it get here? The small stone cottage, it's built out of Platteville limestone, which is very particular to this area and really more to the driftless region just south of us. And so this building was built in 1852-53, kind of a little bit in one year, and then things had to stop for the river freezing over and construction stopping for the winter. But we know that it was finished by 1853 because we have some records of folks living in the house and talking about having their first holiday season there. And so until it was demolished a year and a half ago or so, it was, or about 2 years ago now, it was the oldest residential structure in St. Paul and one of the oldest buildings in the state of Minnesota still standing. And so this was a tiny building, but it really held quite an important piece of history attached to it, and it was really something, even if in need of some repairs, was something worthy of saving. And so the building was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1975. If you're unfamiliar with the parameters of that program, buildings can be nominated for a variety of different reasons, and so sometimes it's for architectural significance, if it's a really ornate building or it has, different cornices and, or a particular architect that it's attached to or some kind of architectural significance. In other cases, the nomination is related to an important person or an important moment in time or some kind of connection to history itself, or sometimes to cultural history. And so in this case, the building in the 70s was added to the National Register for the connections to the Ramsey family. So Justus Ramsey himself was the brother of Alexander Ramsey, who was was the first territorial governor of Minnesota and later a U.S. senator. And so all of the reasoning that they put forth that this home should be preserved for the future was centered around the family's connection to the house and to other early pioneers. And so Ramsey himself moved to Minnesota in 1849. They came from initially the East Coast, but had done some business downriver as well, very tied to real estate interests, but also made some money in groceries and other business kind of in boom towns around the region. He bought up the larger piece of land that the Justus Ramsey House sat, which is right on West 7th. It later ended up kind of surrounded by a patio for Burger Mo's restaurant. And so it's kind of right on the outskirts of downtown there on West 7th. But initially, this was one of the first buildings in that greater neighborhood. And so there was a whole bunch of nothing around it when this stone cottage was built. And it was part of a larger plot of land that Ramsey bought with Sibley and Rice and some other big names from local history. And so it was part of this bigger Lot 8, and then it was subdivided, and Justus Ramsey got this smaller portion of land that the cottage ended up on. He never lived in the house. And so we've always attached his name to it, and we call it the Justus Ramsey House, and there's no evidence he ever lived there. We might later find evidence that he was there for a few months, but piecing together all of the other people that we know are there, it's unlikely he never spent any time there. And so the home was only, the property was only in his possession for 10 years or so. And then there was a financial depression. He also had some bad gambling habits and some other issues, but eventually the property ended up transferred to his brother in 1859, and then within another decade or so after was transferred to other owners. And so besides Ramsey, there's a few other folks that we can attach to those early territorial years in St. Paul, some of the first residents that we know are in the house. Robert O. Smith, Smith Bridge, Smith Avenue. This is the Robert Smith. So he was both mayor of St. Paul at 3 different points, not consecutive, but he was also the state treasurer and the territorial librarian. So he's the first person after it was built that we know is living there for a few years. And then there's 2 brothers, the Munger brothers, Russell and Roger. Russell stayed here in St. Paul. He was a big booster of the arts and music, and there was marching bands that he started, and art galleries and museums, and he was very much wanting to bring culture to this early kind of roughneck territorial town. And so that was where his interests lie. His brother Roger made what would today be probably tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in natural resources of the North, primarily in lumber, but also in some other industries up north. And he's one of the early boosters of Duluth. And so while his brother is kind of helping build St. Paul, after the 2 lived in the house, the one brother went north to Duluth and put all of his business and kind of municipal civic interest in the community up there. And then we know that by the 1930s, it's no longer a home. It's only 475 square feet, I should mention. And so by the 1930s, it kind of moves to commercial interest. And so on the left here, you can see what is a barber shop at the time, owned by a woman named Lizzie Battles. She's an African-American woman who ran her own business here. And then later on, it was a gay couple, open gay couple in the 1930s who opened an antique store. They were, as everyone else, all of the big money names in St. Paul were losing money and houses and art and furnishings from the Depression and from, stock market losses and that kind of thing, and changes to inheritance taxes. All of the rich folks in town were getting rid of all of the really fancy art and furnishings and other things, and it was a great time to be in the antiques business. And you see this across the country. 1930s, great time to be in the antiques business. And so they run an antique store out of the building for a number of years. The facade changes over the years. And so that building on the left, the front end of the building is where she had her barber shop, but it's built on to what we now think of as that small stone cottage. And so it's an extra facade on the front end of the house where the business would be operated from, and then you could go through the door, and then the living quarters were in the back. And so there was at least a few decades where it looked like it did on the left here, where rather than being, the entryway being offset from the sidewalk and street, that it, because of that extra building, it's now kind of right up against the street. There's also the issue of addresses changing. So these are just 4 or 5 of the addresses that we know that the building held over the years. And so for anybody that does research or genealogy research or anything, when you're looking through census records and city directories and other things to try to track down your people, normally you have a set address to go by. But because of the small nature of the building and where it sat on the property and how it was attached to other buildings around, as well as street number irregularities and changes over the years, that we see it in records listed as a few different addresses, which kind of complicates a further understanding of it. You can almost see here on the left-hand side, what is the eastern side of the building is right up next to the commercial building right next to it. And so at one point in time, the larger structure on the right was a hotel or a boarding house or something, and the Justus Ramsey House was used as the kitchen portion for that building, and so it was kind of an offset of that building. And because of that, there had been an opening. That opening on the one wall kind of created some of the later kind of structural issues that existed. But literally, this neighborhood built up around this house. And so it was one of the first structures there, and everything else was built up around it, including the street. And so this is, originally Fort Road, and this is the main line between Fort Snelling and this kind of early territorial boomtown. And so this is really right on the main drag at one point in time. But we see the changes over the years when the street trolley comes in, when there's street widening on West 7th to make room for more businesses and more traffic, that this is a house that sustained a lot of different changes, not just in the ways that it was used, but in the neighborhood itself and in the transportation networks and everything. When the house was first built, this was still steamboat culture. So we're a mere few blocks from where steamboats would be coming in, from where most of the commerce coming through the entire region is really coming in around this core neighborhood. Here's it pictured more recently, and you can see it kind of right up against the building next to it, which is the former hotel that I mentioned. And it had been used as a bar patio space next to a restaurant for the past 20 years or so. And so despite the National Register nomination that we talked about earlier, that the most recent owner decided that some of the structural issues that existed, which he was technically responsible for buying a property that was on the National Register and knowing that repairs needed to be done and that upkeep needed to happen. But despite that, this owner was arguing that the building was too unsafe and just needed to be demolished and torn down. And so he went to the city for a permit to demolish it. But luckily, preservationists and community members and other folks did not agree with that assessment and wanted further reports done and studies and more information about what are the ways that this home could be preserved or shared for future generations. And so community members came out in full force. This is in the dead of the winter, December, January, out there on the streets fighting for this building. But despite all of this, despite having a National Register nomination and that perceived protection that you think that might offer, and despite at one point, the Historic Preservation Commission had turned down the request to demolish the building, that the mayor came in and allowed the demolition. And so thankfully they did set aside a little bit of money to at least be able to take the house apart and put it into storage until a next step could be decided upon. And so while not a huge amount and probably not quite enough to cover it, $84,000 was set aside for this purpose. And so really at the last minute, with really only a matter of days, architects and preservationists and archaeologists and all sorts of folks, stonemasons, came out to help in this process, measuring and documenting and numbering each and every single piece that came out of that building so that it could be rebuilt in exactly the same manner. And so for the past 2 years, it's been in storage. You can see some of this process here of some of this Platteville limestone came from the structure. And measurements of the famously pink door. you can see some of the damage here on the image on the right. It definitely needs some work. I don't think anyone was arguing that it did not need some help or that there were not some potential safety issues. But all very, very fixable. Quite a lot of entirely original pieces, original handmade nails, and just. And so, as they're taking everything apart, there was at the same time a bid process. So the West 7th Fort Road Federation put out a call for proposals of interested parties in becoming the next home of the Justus Ramsey House. And so some were museums and cultural heritage institutions or folks that had that kind of mindset for the building. There was also folks who, I know there was a lawyer who wanted to use it at one point for his law offices. So there's a variety of different people that had a potential stake in this. And luckily, the Minnesota Transportation Museum was selected as the next owner. And so as you pull in and see the pile of dirt out there, that is going to be where the home is going to be sitting, right next to the Rutledge Depot there. And ideally, we're going to be putting those buildings into conversation with one another. In an ideal world, also maybe utilizing that outdoor space there as well to kind of to truly make this kind of a conversational and learning opportunity in that corner of the museum property. And so why here? How did the Transportation Museum end up with this building? How does this building connect to what's going on here? Good question. So I talked about that first National Register listing, and they talk about the connection to Alexander Ramsey, and they talk about the Munger brothers and the big business interests and the territorial governor, and all white names. And so there is a portion from the 1890s through the 1930s. The largest portion of the residential history of that house the house was actually home to African American families. And so all of those names and stories are missing from what the government had said the significance of this building is. And it turns out that a number of those actually worked in the railroad industry, both as porters but also stewards, as maids, in a variety of different professions within that work. And so the new exhibits and curriculum and interpretive elements related to the Justus Ramsey House are all going to focus on that railroad porter history. And I know you guys already have a strong start in that work and have done some exhibits in the past. And if anything, it's just going to be building off of that. And really using the house itself as kind of the central point with which we can tell stories, but telling stories not just about those who lived in the house, but also the neighborhood and the city, and thinking about how these stories are representative of larger stories within Black history. So for those that are unfamiliar with the Pullman porters, this profession in general emerged kind of as a legacy and continuation of steamboat workers. And so most of my research, if you've seen me talk anywhere else around town, is normally around the Underground Railroad and early Black communities in the 1850s, 1860s in St. Paul. And many of those individuals are working on the steamboats as stewards and porters in very similar positions. And so if you're familiar with some of the racial dynamics of Pullman porters later and some of those hierarchies and some of the stereotypes and some of the nasty language and the unfair working conditions and all of the other issues that later railroad porters experienced, a lot of that is built on a system that already existed under slavery. And so a lot of the original porters that are helping travelers with bags and meals and their sleeping quarters and all of these different positions as they're traveling are mirror images of what we see later in the railroad industry. And so for the most part, this is men. For the most part, it's young men. These are long weeks, 80, 100-hour weeks, traveling thousands of miles without going home. sometimes having to be on call for days at a time. And so you wouldn't even truly be able to sleep. Someone could interrupt you at any point to go have you do something or fetch something or make something. If their guests broke something or pocketed a towel or something from the room, as people do, it came out of the Pullman porters' paychecks. As they were traveling around the country and had stopovers in places, if they needed to stay the night, often there was nowhere where they were allowed to stay. If there's no hotel or boarding house or anything that allows African Americans to stay there, they can't stay on the train, they can't stay in town, and if they can find somewhere, it's out of their pocket. And so many of these men relied on boarding houses. Both for when they're on the road, but also for when they're at home. They're only home for a couple days here and there. They don't have, they're not tethered in a way that many in community are. And so these were men that lived very mobile lives. And so it both had these limitations, but it was also an opportunity to make some money, to send back home, to bring family members and neighbors and others from your community into this line of work. And so we know that it's also this great opportunity for building the Black middle class and for really establishing these positions that allowed men to work up into higher roles and into different salary ranges. Others we know are only working in the field for a handful of years, and it's really just a stopover into other work. And so there's a variety of different individuals that we see working in this industry in St. Paul. There's a handful of women that we know are working both for the Pullman Company as well as Great Northern and others working as chambermaids. There's not a lot of research on their experiences as on the Pullman lines, but there's been a lot written on the experiences of chambermaids in the earlier steamboat travel. And many of these women, the vast majority of these women, experienced not just sexual assault, but really violent rapes, including a few deaths. And so it's not an easy life for a woman to be in this field as well, which is a very male field. Back home in St. Paul, there's also wives and sisters and mothers and neighbors that are here at home that are organizing women's auxiliary groups, doing a great amount of organizing out in the community. And so they're really active with the unions. They're holding picnics and fundraisers and Sunday dinners, and they're really on the ground kind of organizing the larger community of Pullman porters. It's these stories that we really want to feature in the future exhibits. The space, as I mentioned, is only 475 square feet. And so while there's brief conversation about do we set this up like a home with a closet and a bed and a little table and everything, and it's truly such a small space, and thinking about the fact that this will be used for school tours and other things, we want to make sure that that one, it's accessible, that folks that have accessibility needs can make it through the space without restrictions, but also that it encourages exploration and kind of digging into potential stories. And so I think most likely the exhibits will not be room-based, or it won't feel like a house necessarily when you walk in, but that it'll have some flexibility to it. And so similar to elsewhere in the museum, these might be movable stanchions that we can move out of the way. They might be pop-up banners. They might be exhibit panels that lock onto and snap onto the wall, but then can be removed. But I think there's potentially great opportunities there for holding events like this in that great small little space, for making some extra money for the museum, holding weddings or other public events. It's such a beautiful little building that I think there's a lot of opportunities there for ways that it can be used. And so having a space that can both be a museum, but can also be easily kind of covered up and and be a more generic space. As mentioned earlier, I'd also love to use that outdoor space This could look like little memory bricks, or it could look like little storytelling areas, or mini stories outside for when the building's not open, in which there could still be some kind of learning going on in that outdoor space. And then, as I mentioned, that I don't want it to just be stories of the house itself and those that lived there, but the neighborhood, the larger neighborhood of West 7th, it's really the first neighborhood in Minnesota, that there's a number of Pullman porters who are living there during those early years. And so telling the stories of not just those in the house, but neighbors who lived down the street and folks they worked with and other stories. But we also know that beyond West 7th, there's folks living in Dayton's Bluff. There's the earliest iteration of the Rondo community. We have Pullman porters living there. And so it's being able to tell stories of Pullman porters across the city. A number of porters that we know are living in the house. We have Lee Barber, Henry Reed, Victor Tolles, George Williams, William Moore, Willie Howard, and others. And so we know that there's at least 6 or 8 men that are working as Pullman porters living in the home. Despite the fact that it's 475 square feet, at 2 different points, this was kind of a boarding house. And so there's a family with 2, 3, 4 members, and then there's 2, 3, 4 boarders living there as well in this 475 square foot house. But again, they were probably only there for a couple nights at a time and then gone for 2 weeks at a time, and they just happened to be there when the census taker came through and wrote down their names. And so this is one of those other individuals. I should back up a moment. If you've heard me talk before, I've probably talked about data and about collecting data and about building spreadsheets of data about history. That's kind of where my research lies. And so I've been going through the census records and kind of reverse engineering it to not look by address, but to look solely, or not look for a specific person, but to look for general types. And so really looking through the records of individuals that are showing up as African American or mulatto in the records, but that we know are also working in the railroad industry, or who show up as their profession as porter or steward or any other known roles. And so I've been building out of a spreadsheet of who do we know who was working in the industry? Where are they at different points in time? Where are they coming from? Where are they going to? And in doing so, came across this interesting household here. This is Lucian Porter Gibson. What an apt middle name, or mother's maiden name, or however he ended up with the Porter. We know that he's a railroad porter in a few different censuses, but he also shows up in other industries. So for him, the railroad porter was a means to support his other work. He was actually a professional musician, became quite a noted ragtime composer. You could go on YouTube or anywhere right now and Google his name, and you'll see a number of different compositions, or you can hear a number of different compositions that he wrote from that time period. And so we have him living at 153 West Central Avenue, which today would be almost on the Capitol grounds, maybe underneath John Ireland Boulevard a little there, but somewhere in what would be the Capitol region. That whole area, all of that state land, all of those roads that center that part of downtown, used to be primarily an African American neighborhood, and we don't talk about it much before, and so we see the original Black community in St. Paul starting right downtown by the levee, by where the steamboats are coming in. They gradually move to West 7th. They gradually move from West 7th up to the Capitol area, and they move from the Capitol area to Rondo. And so we see this community gradually moving block by block, being pushed out further into Rondo, and then again being pushed out with the highways. And so this one family, there's 2 individuals who live in the house, and then there's the 2 boarders, Lucian Gibson and another man named Gus Ewing. In a different, I don't think I have a clip of it here, in a different census record, he shows up as a celluloid musician. which my assumption is he's a silent film musician, is my assumption. Celluloid was a type of film used during silent films, and so I think he worked for a movie theater or something, playing piano or something to go with music. And so there's both of those men, both musicians, but both working as Pullman porters, living in this household. But I featured this household because the people they're living with, H. Lewis Christopher and his daughter, my other research about 1850 St. Paul, about the Underground Railroad and building out their networks of early Black St. Paul, one of the radical Black abolitionists that I'm looking at that's moving between Galena and St. Paul is Henry Christopher. And so it's his son that is now living in St. Paul, 20, 30 years later, not working in the steamboats as his father did, but working as a railroad porter. And so there's these connections between earlier Black history in town and later Black history in town. But as I mentioned, there's individuals that we know live in Rondo, like Wade Hamilton. We have men like Frank Boyd on the right, who was a labor organizer for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He also tried to organize folks 20 years earlier than that. And so he had been at it for a long time, paved the way for the Brotherhood. And then for anyone that's been working on James J. Hill's car, we also know that Hill himself had Robert Miner, who worked with him on the railroads and served as his attendant. And so when will construction start? As you can see, it's already getting there a little bit. So we've been in the process of getting bids from contractors, from working with architects, from getting final decisions made about how thick are the baseboards and where do we want to put the HVAC and what kind of plaster should the walls have. And so we've been thinking really thoughtfully about how do we ensure that the building is built with historic integrity, but also in a way that's modernized and not going to break the bank and still allows for, air conditioning and ADA widths for doorways and that kind of thing. And so there's work happening behind the scenes. So even though we're about the process now where the renderings are done, we know all of the contractors who are working on the project. It's just a matter of getting all of the schedules to align to start that work. And there is the prep work that needs to be done. And so the ground clearing, the removing of trees, getting everything level. And so might still happen this year, but I think more likely it's going to be kind of early spring is when we might see an actual cornerstone laying or that kind of action. But besides that, there's still work happening behind the scenes. And so all of those elements that were taken apart and put into storage, while the stones are in outdoor storage right now, many of the other elements are inside workshops being worked on right now. And so the doors, the windows, a lot of the trim, anything that was salvageable is being restored right now. So you can see some of it here. This is one of those handmade nails that I was talking about. The picture doesn't do it justice. 172-year-old nail, just perfect. And so this is the original doorway. You can see it was 2 inches shy, not even an inch and a half shy of being ADA width compliant. But by widening that, then it widens everything else and all of the stones fit together perfectly, and so it's a matter of adding, like a 1/4 inch extra of mortar between certain things, and so that it's all, spaced out evenly to then allow for the ever so slightly wider door. And so putting a lot of thought into this, and really some great work happening by preservationists in town. So we've been working, Pelco Construction has been our biggest partner in this, but also working with Capital Masonry, Historic Design Consulting, and some other folks around town who are each, perfectionists at what they're doing. And so we have some folks that are doing the Platteville limestone, others that do woodwork, And so really have a great team put together. But we're still just not quite there. So we've been thankful to have a little bit of support from the government and from private donors. But really, as you can imagine, in these days with tariffs and other things, that construction is expensive, even for a small building like this. And so we're having a fundraiser tonight to help fill out some of those costs. And so even in addition to the construction cost itself, wanting to make sure that we have enough money to do community education, to do K-12 curriculum, to expand kind of how we're thinking about the potential reach for this building. And so if you're free tonight, or if you want to talk after this about ways that you can be involved, I'm happy to talk to you about where support's needed. We also know that folks have passion projects. So maybe you're really into the historic preservation part and you really want to earmark some money straight for that. Wonderful. We'd love to be able to start an internship program for emerging scholars who are just entering the field, potentially even a digital scholarship to kind of expand some of the reach that we can think of with digital exhibits and interactive elements potentially from the new space. So whatever your passion area is, we're happy to find a way for you to be involved with this project, because we know that the larger work, knowing who's in the audience right now, knowing that the larger work that you all do as volunteers and collaborators with the MTM, that the work here can't happen without it, and that the same is going to be said for adding this Justus Ramsey House. And so we really would love to see buy-in from both the existing MTM community, but also expanding our audiences and reaching out to some new communities to be able to make sure that this second life of the Justus Ramsey House, that we're here for another 170, you know. Any questions? Yeah.
Well, when you say, I guess maybe I missed the beginning. You're a historian, and who's leading the project then?
So Larry, who many of you know here, is heading many of the construction and preservation elements, and so he's the one wrangling all of the bids and the contractors and working with architects and that kind of thing. I'm handling more of the exhibits and research and community outreach and oral histories. And so in addition to being a civil rights historian, I also teach public history, which is museums and archives and historic preservation and oral history, and work as a nonprofit consultant for entities in this realm. So my specialization is strategic planning, and thinking about the ways that projects like this can move strategically through phases that are logical but still growth-minded, and thinking about making sure that, again, this is all that it can be. We want to make sure if the community saw fit to fight for this house so hard, and that we know that there's really this buy-in from the community to making sure that we're doing it right.
Is there a goal for completion all next year?
I mean, it would be great to have it all be next year. Next year is the semi-quincentennial, America's 250th anniversary. And so around the country, there's going to be celebrations and public events and exhibits and other things that are thinking about how we doing as a nation. How are those ideas of democracy and equality and the American values that we hold so true? How does that look in the real world? How is that realized on the ground or not? Where are the areas that we still might need to do some work? And so I think for states like Minnesota that weren't really a thing during the Revolution, we don't really have that same kind of history as other regions, that thinking about a way, how can we think about the Revolution here in Minnesota, and how can we make it applicable here? And I think it's thinking about stories like this, or what are the stories that we haven't been told, or what are the communities who haven't seen all of those rights and responsibilities of citizenship in the same way. And so thinking about, telling a more comprehensive and complex history, not not a history that misses, 40 years of people living in the home.
A question, the brothers, the Munger brothers, seem to be a family of means. How was their interest, how did they get the interest in the rather modest structure like this? And the old Crowley man was in there. It's amazing.
Yeah. It seems that at least most of the very first residents who lived in the house, it was really just a stopover. There weren't a lot of houses in town to begin with, and there was even fewer rentals and things. And so I think for folks first coming to town and wanting to make their mark here in business or what have you, would stay wherever they could find a spot. Even the bigger names in town were not living in the kind of homes that we now associate with them. And so we think about the Rices and the siblings and Ramsey. That Ramsey mansion was not there during those territorial years. And a lot of it was also built, related to supply and demand and what products were available and what workers were available. And so there's a lot of limestone cottages in those early territorial years. It's very popular building component at the time. And I know that there's a lot of other buildings that are of that same footprint. It's an easy shape to build. It doesn't necessarily need, intricate plans or anything else. And so it's, even though it's rare today, at the time it was kind of a normal building.
Amazing.
170 years is nothing to, and this type of limestone is really, really brittle and hard to work with. And so the reason you don't see it used anymore is that it historically hasn't really held up that well. And so the fact that this building, has some issues, but really a lot of it is original component still, which is impressive for that type of building.
When folks came to town, they didn't exactly go to the Holiday Inn.
Well, and the early black community that I'm starting, that guy ran what was called an eating saloon in a building that looked very much like the Justus Ramsey House, teeny tiny little building. And I had the epiphany that there wasn't even restaurants really in town. I mean, it wasn't, the people coming to town were either there to work or there to make money. So there was fancy hotels, and then boarding houses, and really not a lot in between. Now, by the 1860s or so, it was not long that it kind of lived in that kind of world. There were very soon after more proper buildings and structures. But we had someone reach out to us from out of state who claims that they think that the house was very temporarily used in the first year, not as a home, but as a land leasing agent office or land speculator, but somehow that there was like land sales happening from that structure. But again, I mentioned the issue with all of those addresses changing over the years. Those first years, there were not addresses. There were barely streets. I mean, Fort Road was a street, but it's not the city that we think of today. And so it's hard to even figure out whether there's validity to this person's story that it might have been used as a land office, because how do you prove or disprove what building is being talked about? They're talking about it in relation to another house or at the corner of this and this. Well, it could be a couple different buildings, or so there's still some unknowns really about those earliest years. But we know that Robert Smith lived there. He writes about Christmas in the home in 1853 in a letter or a diary or something. So we know that at least we can connect him to that earliest year. But there's a chance that it was finished the year earlier. Well, happy to answer other questions if folks have any after the fact, but otherwise, thank you.
Is the members of MTM going to be staffing this building, or tools?
I think it's still a little unknown at this point. I think it's probably going to be a combination of staff and volunteers, and I think that there is some fundraising that'll be happening to either expand staff hours or to potentially, as I mentioned, bring in some interns or some like an emerging scholar fellowship or something where we could, maybe they're here for 5 months out of the year or, but it's more of a term commitment. But I think we'll also be doing some fundraising to get some historic reenactors and others here so we can actually kind of bring that Pullman Porter experience to life. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities, but even when staff time is tight or winter months or time periods where we know it's not the same traffic coming through the museum, I think there's still going to be some opportunities with QR codes or outdoor signage or something else to still tell some of those stories from inside of the building on the outside of the building. Great. Well, I hope you can make it tonight if you are able to at Waldman Brewery, but otherwise, thanks so much for coming.